Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, I want to take you into the mind of the avoidant. Not the version you see, not the version they present, but the version they hide. Because when you go silent, when you finally stop explaining, stop reaching out, stop initiating, an entire psychological storm begins inside them. Not on the surface, oh no. Avoidants never reveal the surface. But deep inside, their thoughts shift in ways that will shock you. When you first go silent, the avoidant doesn't interpret it the way you do. You think silence communicates distance, withdrawal, emotional exhaustion, or a boundary. But an avoidant hears something entirely different. They hear peacey. They assume your quiet is not a sign of leaving but a sign of settling. This is the first surprising assumption they make, and it reveals exactly how their emotional system is wired. Avoidants grew up learning that silence is safety. They were taught, not directly, but through experience, that quiet means no danger, no emotional explosions, no pressure, and no expectations. So when you go silent, their body relaxes, their nervous system calms, their guard goes down just a little. They tell themselves, everything is fine. This is why your silence never scares them at first. They don't assume you are upset. They don't assume you are pulling back. They don't assume you are hurt. They certainly don't assume you're done. Instead, they mistakenly believe your silence is simply you being stable. They think you're calm, collected, and not needing anything from them in this moment. It's not that they don't care. It's that they misread silence, because they are emotionally conditioned to experience it differently. Avoidants come from environments where emotional intensity was overwhelming, unpredictable, or unsafe. They learned early that keeping quiet, staying contained, and avoiding emotional expression protected them. Silence became their refuge. So now as adults, when someone goes silent, even someone they care deeply for, their first emotional association is comfort, not fear. They don't automatically think, something's wrong. They think, finally, things aren't heavy. They interpret your quiet as a reduction in pressure, not a sign of emotional withdrawal. This is why avoidants don't respond quickly when you stop reaching out. They assume you're simply giving them space, something they often crave but rarely communicate honestly. They believe your silence means you're not demanding anything, not needing anything, not asking for emotional closeness. They take it as a sign that the relationship has temporarily returned to a level of intensity that feels manageable to them. It doesn't occur to them that your silence might be coming from a place of hurt, confusion, or disappointment. To them, silence feels neutral. It feels normal. It feels like a break in emotional stimulation, a break they believe benefits both sides. They may even interpret your quiet as emotional maturity, not emotional exhaustion. They see it as stability, not distance. That's why the beginning of no contact never rattles them. They are not wired to interpret silence as loss. They unconsciously assume you are still emotionally present and available even if you're not actively communicating. They think they're just taking a moment. Not, they're pulling away. They think they're still here. Not, they're healing without me. This assumption is not arrogance. It's not intentional ignorance. It's the predictable outcome of their attachment pattern. Avoidants do not connect silence with emotional danger, because their entire coping strategy revolves around minimizing emotional intensity. As long as you aren't expressing big feelings, they assume everything is okay. They trust silence more than communication. They feel safer when things are unspoken. They don't fear the quiet. They fear the emotions hidden behind it. Emotions they don't assume you're feeling until the silence lasts long enough to become noticeable. In the early stages of your silence, they are not thinking about you leaving. They are not imagining you moving on. They are not worried about losing access to you. They believe they still have emotional space in your heart. They think the connection is intact even without words. They don't interpret silence as change because change, for them, usually comes through conflict, not calmness. They assume silence means stability, not transition. This is why avoidants don't chase you when you first pull back. They simply don't interpret it as loss. They believe nothing significant has happened. They assume you are still there, still emotionally connected, still within reach. And in their world, silence is not a rupture. It is a reset. But this is also why, later, when the silence stretches longer and the energy between you truly shifts, the awakening hits them like a shock. What they initially assumed to be harmless begins turning into something else. Something they didn't expect, something they didn't prepare for, something they now have to confront. Your silence brings them peace at first, only because they misunderstand what it truly means. When you stop reaching out, the avoidant makes one of the most revealing and misunderstood assumptions of all. They truly believe you are still emotionally attached to them, even in your silence. This assumption does not come from arrogance or entitlement. It comes from their attachment wiring, their emotional history, and the way they've learned to interpret connection. Avoidants assume emotional bonds remain intact, even when communication disappears, because that's the emotional pattern they have lived in their entire lives. Avoidants grew up in environments where emotional closeness was inconsistent, present one moment, gone the next. They learned to adapt by disconnecting internally, while still functioning externally. Their emotional world taught them one lesson repeatedly: just because someone is quiet doesn't mean the relationship is gone. So as adults, they carry that same belief into romantic dynamics. When you go silent, they don't think you're moving on. They assume you're just quiet, but still attached. Your silence does not trigger fear in them at first because they believe feelings don't change quickly. They assume you still care the way you did yesterday, the day before, and the weeks before that. Avoidants operate with an internal sense of emotional permanence, not in themselves, but in others. They believe that if you loved them once, you still do. If you chased them before, you still want them now. If you cared deeply, that care isn't going anywhere. They assume your emotional investment is stable and reliable, even if you stop showing it. This is why avoidants don't respond urgently to your silence. They don't think you're creating distance. They don't think you're detaching. They don't think you're questioning your own worth or reevaluating the relationship. They assume your silence is passive, not intentional. They believe you still feel everything you used to feel. You're just choosing not to express it for the moment. Avoidants unconsciously view your feelings as something they can depend on, even though they struggle to reciprocate consistently. They bank on your emotional loyalty. They rely on the history between you. They take comfort in the certainty that your heart was once open to them. And they assume it still is. In their worldview, silence doesn't erase emotional connection, it merely pauses expression. This is why they don't check in. Why they don't chase. Why they don't panic. Why they don't ask what's wrong. Not because they don't care, but because they think they still have you. They interpret your silence as patience. They interpret your withdrawal as understanding. They interpret your distance as emotional maturity. They do not interpret it as detachment, loss, or change. This assumption reveals something important. Avoidants are not tuned into emotional signals the way others are. They miss nuance. They miss shifts in closeness. They miss the emotional temperature dropping. They assume stability where there is actually a slow unraveling. They believe your loyalty is fixed, not fluid. To an avoidant, your love is still there, even in silence. To you, silence is a sign of exhaustion or boundaries. To them, silence is simply a break in communication. This misinterpretation is why avoidants often return months later shocked by how much you've changed. They never expected your silence to evolve into detachment. They never imagined you were healing, gaining clarity, or reclaiming your emotional independence. In their minds, you were still emotionally present the entire time, just temporarily quiet. And this assumption is rooted in something even deeper. Avoidants believe others feel more strongly about them than they feel about themselves. They carry a quiet expectation that people don't stop caring easily. They believe emotional bonds are hard to lose because they themselves are slow to form new emotional attachments. So they assume you're the same. Your silence doesn't signal an ending to them. It signals less pressure. It signals less intensity. It signals a connection that is still there, just quiet for now. They don't realize you might be redefining the connection entirely. They don't see that silence can be a sign of protection after pain. They don't recognize that your stillness is intentional, not passive. They cannot imagine that you might be withdrawing your emotional investment piece by piece. To the avoidant, silence means, you're still here, just quieter. To you, silence means, I'm stepping back to find myself again. This difference is the emotional gap that defines avoidant dynamics. They believe you're still emotionally close, even when you're quietly walking away. And by the time they realize your silence meant something deeper, your heart has often already crossed a boundary they never saw coming. Your silence feels safe to them, until it becomes real distance. And by then, the assumption that you were still emotionally attached no longer matches the reality they face. When your silence lasts longer than an avoidant expects, something shifts inside them that they would never admit out loud. Jealousy. Quiet, subtle, internal jealousy. And this jealousy is not rooted in possessiveness or entitlement. It is rooted in fear, insecurity, and the one belief avoidants rarely confront: someone else might now be receiving the emotional attention they once took for granted. This is the third keynote, and it reveals the emotional depth avoidants keep hidden beneath their detached surface. Avoidants rarely show jealousy externally because jealousy exposes vulnerability. It shows that they care, that they feel threatened, that they fear losing someone, and expressing those emotions goes against everything their attachment system taught them. Avoidants were conditioned to appear strong, self-sufficient, unaffected. They believe that showing longing or fear makes them weak. So even when jealousy rises inside them, they swallow it down, hide it, deny it, and pretend it doesn't exist. But internally, that jealousy is real. It's sharp, it's uncomfortable, and it grows as your silence continues. At first, they convince themselves nothing is wrong. They tell themselves you're just taking space. They assume you're still emotionally connected. But as time passes and the silence deepens, their mind begins to wander into territories they can't control. They start imagining you talking to someone else. Someone emotionally available, someone consistent, someone who listens, someone who values you without hesitation. And the avoidant, who once felt comfortable withdrawing, suddenly realizes that someone else might be stepping into the emotional space they vacated. Jealousy for an avoidant doesn't come with accusations or anger. It comes with questions they don't want to confront. Questions like, why are they so quiet? Who are they giving their attention to instead? Are they happy now that I'm not involved? Is someone else giving them what I couldn't? These questions create a discomfort avoidants are not equipped to handle. They've built their identity around being detached, around believing they don't need anyone, around pretending they don't care enough to be replaced. So when jealousy creeps in, it exposes the cracks in that identity. They start reading your last conversations. They check your social media silently. They remember moments where you seemed distracted. They notice subtle changes they ignored before. They sense that your emotional energy feels different now, and that difference scares them. Avoidants are experts at controlling emotional distance. They decide when to withdraw. They decide when to open up. They decide the pace of the relationship. But your silence removes their control. For the first time, you are the one regulating the emotional distance, and avoidants don't know how to handle that shift. Their assumption that you were still emotionally available begins to crumble, replaced with a fear they don't want to acknowledge. That your heart might be drifting somewhere else. Jealousy hits avoidants uniquely. It doesn't make them chase loudly. It doesn't make them confront you. It makes them withdraw further at first. They overanalyze. They wonder. They observe. They sit in their discomfort quietly. But internally, their fear of losing their emotional place in your life starts growing. They begin comparing themselves to imaginary scenarios, the hypothetical new person who texts you consistently, who listens without disappearing, who doesn't make you feel confused. Even if no one else exists, the avoidance fear makes them assume someone might. This jealousy is tied to something deeper. The avoidance fear of being emotionally irrelevant. They fear being forgotten more than they fear closeness. Losing someone to their own avoidance feels like a failure they can't blame on you. They start realizing that their emotional distance created an opening for someone else. And that thought hits harder than any argument, any breakup discussion, or any emotional confrontation. Your silence becomes the catalyst that awakens this hidden fear. They begin to realize they may have taken your attention, your devotion, your presence for granted. They begin noticing the absence of your energy in their life. The lack of your messages, the missing emotional warmth they once assumed was permanent. Suddenly the avoidant becomes aware that your silence is not just quiet time. It is a shift, a potential loss, a sign that someone else might be stepping into the emotional space they once dominated. Avoidants don't express this out loud, but inside, jealousy begins reshaping their perception of you. You are no longer the person who chases. You are no longer the person who tries harder. You are no longer emotionally predictable. Instead, you become someone who is capable of choosing themselves. Someone who can pull away. Someone who can stop giving. Someone who can redirect their emotional energy elsewhere. And nothing scares an avoidant more than the realization that the person who once made them feel safe, understood, and valued might now be turning that same emotional power towards someone else. Jealousy becomes the first emotional consequence they truly feel. The quiet alarm that wakes them from their emotional numbness. The subtle realization that silence is not indifference. It is transformation. Your silence doesn't just create distance. It triggers the avoidant's deepest insecurity. That they could lose you to someone who knows how to hold you, while they only knew how to push you away. When your silence lasts long enough to disturb the avoidant's emotional equilibrium, something begins to shift inside them that they never intended to confront. Our self-reflection, DIRS. And this is where the fourth keynote comes in. They begin to wonder if they caused the distance. This moment is not immediate. It doesn't happen in the first hours or even the first days. But eventually, when your silence becomes undeniable, the avoidant begins to sense the emotional consequences of their own behavior. Avoidants spend most of their relationships protecting themselves from discomfort. They avoid vulnerability because it feels unsafe. They avoid emotional intimacy because it feels overwhelming. They avoid responsibility because it triggers shame. A feeling avoidants are terrified of experiencing. So when you were reaching out, trying, explaining, reassuring, offering your heart, they could comfortably remain in their defensive shell without feeling responsible for anything. They interpreted your effort as emotional stability. They assumed your willingness to stay meant they weren't doing anything wrong. But silence removes that illusion. Your absence becomes a mirror they can no longer avoid, and in that mirror, they begin seeing reflections they spent years running from. For the first time, the avoidant starts asking themselves questions they never wanted to confront. Did I push them away? Was I too cold? Did I ignore them? Was I emotionally unavailable? Did I make them feel unimportant? These questions feel like emotional needles piercing through their carefully built armor. Avoidants don't like seeing themselves clearly because what they see often triggers shame. The shame of not showing up, not giving enough, not choosing emotional courage when it mattered. And shame is the emotion they suppress more than anything else. Yet your silence forces them into that vulnerability. They begin replaying the last conversations between you. The messages they left unanswered. The affection they shrugged off. The moments when you reached for closeness and they responded with distance. The times you needed reassurance, and they stayed silent. This replay is not loud. It's quiet, internal, private, but powerful. Avoidants don't express regret openly, because admitting regret requires acknowledging their own emotional shortcomings. But inside, they begin to feel a subtle guilt, a slow, burning awareness that perhaps their avoidance wasn't as harmless as they believed. Your silence disrupts their belief that everything was fine. It breaks the narrative that nothing they did mattered. It challenges the idea that you would always be there regardless of their behavior. Avoidants learn to detach to survive, not to hurt others. They don't push you away out of malice. They push you away because intimacy triggers the parts of them they don't know how to manage. But even they cannot ignore the consequences forever. Your silence becomes evidence of those consequences. It forces them to realize that withdrawing, shutting down, and avoiding emotional presence comes with a cost that now feels far too real. This self-reflection often feels like emotional discomfort. It can be mistaken for anxiety, confusion, or irritability. Avoidants don't label their emotions accurately. They feel things before they understand them. They sense that something is wrong, but don't immediately connect the dots. But over time, the dots connect themselves. They begin to sense the pattern. You stopped talking after I stopped showing up. You pulled back after I distanced myself. You went quiet after I made you feel alone. This awareness scares them because now they can no longer blame circumstances, timing, or needing space. Your silence exposes the truth that their behavior contributed to the emotional gap. And once that awareness enters their mind, it doesn't leave easily. The avoidant starts noticing the emptiness your absence creates. They feel the missing warmth. They feel the silence where your reassurance used to be. They feel the lack of messages they once ignored. They feel the shift in your energy, even from afar. This discomfort is what finally makes them question their own behavior. It's the beginning of accountability. Not spoken, not acted upon immediately, but internally acknowledged. And for an avoidant, this is a massive shift. They rarely examine their emotional impact on others. They rarely take responsibility for contributing to relationship problems. They rarely reflect unless something forces them to. Your silence forces them to. It reveals to them that emotional distance does not protect relationships, it erodes them. It reveals that avoidance is not a neutral reaction, it is a damaging habit. It reveals that their withdrawal didn't make things easier, it made them fragile. And most painfully, it reveals that someone who cared deeply can grow tired, exhausted, and hurt enough to pull away. Not because they stopped loving, but because they stopped being willing to carry the emotional weight alone. Your silence becomes the moment they realize that their avoidance was not invisible. It had consequences. And those consequences are now staring them right in the face. Through the quiet you chose, when your silence no longer looks like a momentary pause, but a true shift in energy, the avoidant reaches a point they didn't see coming. The realization that your silence is intentional, not accidental. This is the fifth keynote, and it marks the moment when the avoidant's emotional control begins to crumble. Avoidants build their emotional world around predictability. They depend on knowing the rhythm of your connection. You reach out, they respond when comfortable, you initiate, they pull back, you express, they retreat. This cycle may frustrate you, but to them it feels familiar, it feels safe, it feels like control. Your silence destroys that control. At first, they believe your quiet is nothing more than a breather, something temporary, something harmless. But as the days pass and you remain silent, a subtle discomfort begins to creep in. Avoidants are not emotionally blind. They sense when something is off. They may not be good at naming emotions, but they're excellent at noticing patterns. And when the pattern of your connection breaks, they start noticing the shift. A shift that makes them uneasy. Your silence no longer feels like space. It feels like distance. It feels like change. It feels like something they didn't approve, didn't control, and didn't prepare for. Avoidants rely heavily on the assumption that they will feel closeness again whenever they want to. They believe they can return at any moment and the emotional door will still be open. But your silence challenges this deeply held belief. It introduces unpredictability, and unpredictability is the one thing avoidants cannot handle. They begin to sense that the dynamic is not what it used to be. You're not reacting. You're not waiting. You're not orbiting around their inconsistent patterns anymore. Your silence becomes a message, and the avoidant begins to read it. With growing discomfort, for the first time, they feel uncertainty. Why aren't they reaching out? Why does this feel different? Why can't I sense their emotional presence anymore? Avoidants are used to controlling the emotional distance in relationships. They're the ones who decide when to pull back, when to return, when to open up a little, when to shut down entirely. But your silence flips the power dynamic. You've taken control without saying a word. You've changed the emotional landscape without explanation. And avoidants do not respond well when they're no longer steering the emotional direction. Your silence forces them to acknowledge something they never want to face. They are not the only one who can withdraw. They are not the only one who can pull back. They are not the only one who can emotionally detach. This realization scares them, because it means you are not governed by their patterns. You are not dependent on their attention. You are not trapped in the dynamic where they hold the emotional power. Your silence reveals that you are capable of choosing yourself, capable of breaking the cycle, and capable of stepping back without asking their permission. And this is where the avoidant begins to lose emotional control internally. They start noticing things they dismissed before. The emotional warmth they once felt coming from you is missing. The reassurance they used to receive without asking is gone. The emotional safety net they assumed would always exist is no longer there. They can feel the distance emotionally, even if no words are spoken. And because avoidants aren't used to emotional consequences arriving quietly, it takes them time to understand what your silence means. Your silence becomes evidence that their behavior mattered. Evidence that their distance hurt you. Evidence that you were not as emotionally invincible as they assumed. Evidence that you finally reached a breaking point. And as this realization slowly sinks in, the avoidant begins to feel something they cannot control: anxiety. Not loud, explosive anxiety, but a tightening in the chest, a quiet restlessness, a sense that something important is slipping away. They can't rationalize it, and they can't dismiss it. Your silence is no longer a pause. It's a shift in the emotional balance. It tells them you're not waiting in the same place anymore. Avoidants fear emotional intensity, but they fear emotional uncertainty even more. And your silence is the ultimate form of uncertainty. The avoidant can no longer predict your next move. They don't know where you stand. They don't know if you're hurt, healing, or done. They don't know if your silence is a boundary or the beginning of a real goodbye. This lack of control destabilizes them, forcing them into a level of awareness they avoid at all costs. Your silence becomes a wake-up call, a disruption, a fracture in their emotional structure. And for the first time, they realize something they never expected: you are not silently waiting for them, you are silently changing. And that change makes them feel something they cannot hide from. The fear that they have lost control over a connection they thought was always safe. When your silence stretches long enough to break through the avoidant's emotional defenses, a new and unsettling realization begins to take shape within them. The possibility that you might actually be moving on. This is the sixth keynote, and it is the moment that truly shakes the avoidant's internal world. Because while avoidants may act detached, distant, or indifferent on the surface, they have always carried a quiet, unspoken belief: you won't leave. They believe your emotional investment is stronger than your exhaustion. They believe your loyalty overrides your pain. They believe your heart will stay, even if your words stop. So when your silence lasts long enough to signal a genuine shift, it confronts them with a truth they never anticipated: that they may have misjudged your strength, your resilience, and your capacity to let go. Avoidants live in an emotional paradox. They fear closeness because it feels overwhelming, but they also fear losing the people they care about. Losing someone does not hit them immediately because their defenses delay emotional responses. But once the realization sets in that you may be slipping away, it strikes them deeply, far more deeply than they ever show. This delayed emotional impact is exactly why they don't panic when you first go silent. It takes time for the reality to sink in, but when it does, it hits with the force of everything they never expressed. Your silence starts to feel heavier. It feels pointed. It feels intentional. It feels like a message they cannot ignore. They start asking themselves questions they never wanted to confront. Have I lost them? Were they done trying? Did I push them too far? Are they healing without me? Is this the beginning of the end? These questions don't come with immediate answers, and that uncertainty terrifies them more than intimacy ever did. They realize they no longer feel your emotional presence. They no longer sense your energy. They no longer feel the quiet comfort of knowing you're still emotionally tethered to them. And in that emptiness, they begin to feel the emotional consequences of their own behavior. For the first time, they start recognizing the cost of their avoidance. They see how their distance created emotional cracks. They realize their inconsistency pushed you into self-protection. They understand that their withdrawal taught you how to detach. This is where fear truly sets in. Not fear of losing a relationship, but fear of losing the one person who saw them, understood them, and made emotional closeness feel possible. Avoidants may not chase intimacy, but they deeply value emotional safety. And ironically, the emotional safety they found in you is the same safety they sabotaged through their patterns. Now your silence is making them realize that the emotional security they took for granted is disappearing. Your silence forces them to see what they refuse to acknowledge: that you are capable of choosing your peace over chasing them, your healing over hoping for them, your boundaries over begging for them. They realize that you're not being quiet to manipulate them or punish them. You're being quiet because something inside you has shifted. You've stopped waiting. You've stopped overgiving. You've stopped carrying what they wouldn't hold. And this shift scares them in a way words cannot describe. Avoidants fear being emotionally replaced even more than they fear emotional intimacy. They know deep down that if you move on, you may never come back. Not because you're cold, but because you're strong. Not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much for too long. And now that your silence has become a boundary rather than a pause, they feel the threat of losing you. Not in theory, but in reality. This is the first time your silence feels like distance they cannot bridge easily. The first time your absence feels like finality. The first time they sense that their emotional window may be closing. Avoidants are used to relationships where the other person fights, argues, pleads, tries harder. They understand emotional noise. They don't understand emotional quiet. Not when it's this deep. Not when it's this consistent. Not when it's this intentional. Silence disarms them because it forces them into emotional awareness without giving them emotional direction. They don't know what to do next. They don't know if it's too late. They don't know if they should reach out or stay back. Your silence places them in a space of emotional uncertainty they cannot tolerate. They start imagining you healing. They start imagining you growing. They start imagining you finding someone emotionally available. They start imagining you discovering peace they never gave. And those images hit them harder than any breakup conversation ever could. Because now, your silence is not about them. It's about you. Your healing, your boundaries, your self-respect, your emotional liberation. And the avoidant realizes something they never expected. You are no longer standing at the same emotional distance. You are stepping away, quietly, steadily, without looking back. Their biggest fear becomes real. Not that you stop talking, but that you stop needing them. And once an avoidant senses that, it shakes them in a way they cannot numb, avoid, or run from.